From the halls of Montezuma, Kansas, that is, to wherever you may be, this is the Sure and Secure Podcast, a ministry of Morningside Community Church, helping you become sure that Christianity is true and that your salvation is secure through Jesus Christ. I'm Pastor Tim Erickson. Thanks for listening today. Welcome back to the podcast. On recent episodes, I've been making a basic case for the truthfulness of Christianity. I've been laying this out in three main points. First, that we can know the truth about reality. It's actually ridiculous to say something like, that may be true for you, but it's not true for me. If something is true, it is true for everyone, and we can know that. The second main point in this case is that reality insists there is a God. As we look around at the created world around us, we see evidence everywhere of the existence of the God who created it. We're going to talk about that a little bit more today, do a little bit of a deeper dive on an argument for the existence of God. The third point in this argument that we'll get to in a future episode is that Christianity is the true revelation of the God who exists. So that's coming up. We'll get to that in a later episode. But for this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into a moral argument for the existence of God. In the last episode, I pointed to 11 observations that have been used over the years, in some cases over the centuries, to argue for the existence of God. But I wanted to really spend some focused time on this episode, looking at a moral argument for the existence of God. Now, I happen to like many arguments for God's existence. I think there are many that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he really does exist. But some of them can get very technical. Some of them deal with some philosophical ideas that just aren't familiar to the average person. So I like to highlight a moral argument for the existence of God because I think it's one that people can intuitively understand. And if I might say so, it's one that people can even feel to be true beyond just understanding it to be true. Morality hits us in the heart, and so it's a very powerful way to argue for the existence of God. So the argument that I'm going to lay out and analyze and discuss in this episode can be laid out like this. First, if objective moral standards exist, then God exists. Second, objective moral standards do exist. Third, therefore, God exists. Now let's take a look first of all at that second premise, that objective moral standards do exist. I think this is the bigger and more controversial point in this argument. The first premise, if objective moral standards exist, then God exists. I think that's more straightforward. That's going to be more easily accepted by a lot of people. The second premise, though, objective moral standards do exist, that's challenged quite often today, but not for good reason, I don't believe. So let's take a little bit more time, first of all, to think about that. How do we know that objective moral standards exist? How could we defend that? Well, let me give you 4 points. First, we can simply draw on personal experience. We all have a moral sense deeply ingrained in us. We are moral beings, and we cannot escape that fact. We make moral evaluations all the time. We weigh and assess whether a certain choice would be good or whether it would be bad, whether it would be evil, whether something would be right or whether it would be wrong. We make these evaluations all the time. When we see people helping each other, for example, we think, this is good. this is the way things ought to be. On the other hand, when we see people hurting each other, we think, this is bad, this is wrong, this is not the way that things should be. Consider also the fact that we experience guilt when we don't act the way that we should. We feel that guilt even when no other human being knows what we have done. If we have done something completely alone, completely in the privacy of our own home, let's say, and no one else knows about it, nevertheless, we still feel guilt if it was something that we should not have done. This experience was captured and expressed so well in the short story The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. In that story, the main character had committed a murder, and he had seemingly covered his tracks in the most perfect way he could have. It seemed that he could have gotten away with this scot-free. No one would have ever known. In fact, when the police are alerted to the fact that something is wrong, he even invites them into the very room where the murder was committed. He's so certain that he could get away with it. But his conscience in the story is represented by the sound of the deceased man's heart beating. And of course, it's not actually beating. The man has passed away, he's been killed. But in his conscience, he cannot escape the conviction, the definite knowledge that he has done wrong, even though no one else had known what he had done. And that's true for all of us as well, isn't it? We experience that guilt, even if no one else knows our actions. So personal experience shows us that objective moral standards exist. Secondly, we could point to observations from human history and society. Every society in history, every society that's ever existed, every society that exists today has had a moral code. Now, in pre-literate societies, they weren't always written down, but they were certainly understood and they were enforced as well. C.S. Lewis, in his essay, The Abolition of Man, famously pointed out a consistent moral code in societies all across the globe and also across the span of history. It's possible to observe all these different societies and see a moral code, and in many cases, they embraced a very similar standard of morality. Now, sometimes people hear this claim and they think, well, wait a second. Not every society has had a moral code. What about Nazi Germany? That was a deeply immoral society. They didn't have a moral code. Oh, yes, they did. They certainly had a moral code. It was just, unfortunately, a very distorted and deranged moral code. But they certainly had one. Even still, some people might think, well, wait a second, they didn't think murder was wrong. Just think about the Holocaust. They murdered so many people. Well, yes, they did. But the way they reasoned about that in their own minds was that they declared whole categories of people to be subhuman. So essentially, they just redefined murder to suit their own desires. They certainly considered it to be an act of attempted murder when people tried to assassinate Adolf Hitler. They didn't take that very lightly. They thought that was morally wrong, without a doubt. And so, yes, even a society like Nazi Germany had a moral code. And in many ways, it was actually more similar to the codes of other societies than we might initially think. How else do we know that objective moral standards exist? Well, here's a third observation. It's self-defeating to deny their morality. What do I mean by that? Well, think about this statement that we sometimes hear today. You shouldn't push your morality on other people. We hear a statement like that from time to time, don't we, as people are discussing and debating moral issues? One person might say, well, you shouldn't tell others how to live. You shouldn't push your moral standards on other people. But just consider what that statement is actually expressing. It's basically saying it's wrong to tell someone else that he's wrong. That's the very definition of self-defeating right there. That statement does not pass the very test that it establishes. And so we cannot make a moral case against objective moral standards. To do so would be self-defeating. A fourth observation we could make about this as to how we know objective moral standards exist is that it is unlivable to deny them. Even if someone wants to say that morality is just a matter of each person's opinion, it's not actually objective, it's just relative to what each person thinks. If someone wants to say that, no one can actually live that out. If a person makes that claim, they will definitely cry foul when someone wrongs them. That person will still want to make moral judgments about other people. If someone who asserts that moral relativism is true is assaulted by someone else, they're definitely not going to think, gee, what rotten luck that I crossed paths with someone who has a different opinion about bodily harm than I do. No, they're going to think that person did wrong, that that person should have known better than to do what they did, and that they should have acted better than the way that they did. So it is completely unlivable to deny objective moral standards. No one can possibly live that way. So that's a strong proof that objective moral standards really do exist. Okay, so we can defend the truth of moral objectivism by pointing to those four reasons in its favor, but we can also point to the complete failure of its opposite, which would be moral relativism. The viewpoint of moral relativism completely fails to be convincing. When we think about moral relativism, we have to ask ourselves, relative to what? What standard would we have in mind if we're saying that morality is just relative? Well, some have tried to say that morality is relative to my situation, that as we live out our lives, we don't actually bring some elaborate moral code into each situation with us, but that we have to determine what is right and wrong by the details of each situation. Well, that's not actually a relative viewpoint on morality. It's actually a form of moral objectivism. And we can see that in the fact that those who champion situational ethics always have at least one ethical standard that they say is applicable to every situation. For some people, it might be a standard like love thy neighbor. They would say that in every situation, as you're trying to figure out exactly what might be right, exactly what might be wrong, you are supposed to follow the standard of loving your neighbor. Now, they might say that that standard is rather undefined, and you have to figure it out from the details of your situation, but nevertheless, it's a standard that they claim applies to every situation. And that's not relative then, that's objective. Or some might use a standard of do the most good that you can. When you find yourself in a tricky situation, they would say you just have to assess the details of your situation and the options that are available to you, and then you have to do the most good you can. But again, they say that applies to every situation, that one standard itself is not relative to each situation. So this isn't really a form of moral relativism. It's a form of moral objectivism. Now, it might be a minimalist form of that point of view, but it still is moral objectivism. Or if we go back to that question, relative to what? Many people have tried to say that morality is simply relative to my society, that what is right and what is wrong for me is determined by the society in which I live. But that raises several significant questions. First of all, how do I define what my society is? How do I define its boundaries? Do I myself get to choose what the boundaries of my society are? For example, what if I'm in the mafia? Could I declare that my organized crime syndicate is my society and not the laws of my city or my state or my country? Could my crime family be my society? Or what if I find myself in competing societies? That has happened quite often throughout history. Think about the outbreak of the American Civil War. People in the southern states had to face a choice. Am I going to be loyal to my state that just voted to pull out of the Union? Or am I going to be loyal to the United States of America? And in a situation like that, do I just get to choose which society I'm going to stick with? If I get to choose which society's standards I think are right, then morality isn't actually relative to my society, it's relative to my own personal opinion. And all moral philosophers realize that we cannot base morality simply on our own personal opinions. That just completely causes morality to collapse. Notice another thing that comes up if we say that morality is relative to my society. This would actually make social reformers immoral. Now, we tend to celebrate people who see details of their society that are morally wrong and work to change them. Think of someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and how he opposed things like segregation and racism. Well, consider this. If morality is actually relative to the society he found himself in, then it was immoral for him to try to change his society. And that would be true for anyone else. But what kind of moral standard is it that doesn't allow for people to recognize that their society might actually be unjust? So moral relativism would actually rule out the possibility of heroic social reformers. It would also make it impossible for us to fairly judge or assess another society. If morality is relative to the society in which I find myself, then I can't judge anyone else's society because they're not in my society, and I'm not in their society. This very issue came up in the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Many of the Nazi war criminals that were put on trial claimed that they were simply following orders. Their defense was that they hadn't broken any laws because the laws of Nazi Germany actually called for them to take the very actions that they did against the Jewish people and others who were considered undesirable and expendable in their society. But the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials appealed to a greater law, to the existence of a higher law that overrules the laws of any individual nation or society. And that was the basis upon which they prosecuted these Nazi war criminals. So notice they were appealing to moral objectivism. But if moral objectivism doesn't exist, then their prosecution was illegitimate. We couldn't point to the citizens of another nation and tell them that they had done something morally wrong if they were simply following the rules of their own nation. So moral relativism completely fails as a coherent moral theory. And so that's another reason why we know moral objectivism must be true. Now, before we move on to considering premise one of our argument here, we need to understand one vital detail about moral standards, and that is the fact that they are prescriptions about how we ought to behave. They are obligations that are placed on us. In other words, I ought to love my neighbor. I ought to be honest. I ought to be fair and kind. And notice that language that we use. We use that language of ought, right? Well, that's the language of obligations. Now, notice how this makes moral standards different than something like the laws of nature. The laws of nature are not obligations that are placed upon objects. Think of the law of gravity, for example. The law of gravity doesn't say that a rock has an obligation to fall to the ground. A rock doesn't have any obligations. It's a lifeless object that has no choice in the things that happen. So the laws of nature aren't prescribing things, they are describing things. The law of gravity simply describes what will happen to a rock when you drop it, unless some other factor intervenes. And so consider this question then. Who could possibly have the authority to put obligations on the entire human race? If the whole human race has moral obligations that we must follow, who could possibly be in a position to put those obligations upon us? Well, that leads us right back to the first premise of the argument that we've been considering today. And remember again, premise one is, if objective moral standards exist, then God exists. Consider that question again. Who could have the authority to put obligations on the entire human race? Well, no one other than a God who created us. He would have the right to do that since he made us. We owe our very existence to him, and so he could tell us what else we owe to him. He could put moral obligations upon us since he caused us to exist and he keeps us in existence. We really do owe things to him, and so moral standards, objective moral standards, could only be placed upon us by a God who created us. Notice they couldn't even be placed upon us by other human beings. What obligations would I have to a complete stranger? Or think of it from the other point of view. How could a complete stranger put obligations upon me? What do I owe to another human being whom I've never met before? And yet when we consider morality, we understand that we really do have obligations to other human beings from the very first moment that we meet them. And if that's the case, then that has to come from someone other than myself and the person I just met. That moral standard has to come from an authority who is higher than both of us, and that is the God who created us. Now, in order to see this with a little more clarity, let's consider the other main theory in our culture about how we came to exist. And that is the theory of evolution. That is the main competitor, is it not, to the idea of creation in our culture today. So let's think about this. How could morality fit with the theory of evolution? Well, some evolutionary philosophers are perfectly willing to agree that morality is not relative, but it's actually objective. They explain this by saying that evolution has simply made all human beings the same way. Like in the way that we all have the same body structure. For example, it's the norm, at least, for all humans in all places to have 5 fingers. Now, yes, of course, that's not always true of each person, but that's the norm, at least, isn't it? So they would say, likewise, it's normal for all humans in all places to feel an obligation to help each other rather than hurt each other. So they would say that this is an example of objective morality, that just like we don't get to choose whether it's normal to have 5 fingers, we also don't get to choose whether it's normal to feel an obligation to help each other. Now, according to them, evolution has made us this way because it's advantageous for our survival. We are better off in terms of our chances for survival if we feel an obligation to help each other rather than hurt each other. But here's where things get murky, because one thing that evolutionists have to admit is that if evolution had simply happened differently, then what is right and what is wrong would have been different as well. Just like evolution could have conceivably made us with 4 fingers instead of 5, it could have conceivably made us feel that something like rape is actually morally right. And so that's a big problem when we try to fit objective morality together with evolution. We have to acknowledge that things could have easily turned out differently, and that our sense of morality could be very different than what it is. Evolutionists have another big problem with morality. If evolution really is true, well, morality really is nothing more than a trick that natural selection has played on us because it helps us survive. But now that we know morality is just a trick that's been played on us, we don't have an obligation to be moral anymore. Again, from the evolutionary viewpoint, moral standards are not true obligations that we owe to a God who created us. Moral standards are simply adaptations that help us in the struggle for survival. But consider this. Now that I know a trick has been played on me by natural selection, why should I be moral any longer? What if I just don't care if my neighbor survives? What obligation do I have toward him if there is no God and evolution is true? What if helping my neighbor would lessen my own odds of surviving, even by just a little bit? Well, What should I do then? Shouldn't I be more concerned about my own genes and passing those on to the next generation? Why should I help my neighbor if that would put my own survival in jeopardy? Or what if I come to think that my neighbor has inferior genetics and that the whole human race would be better off if he didn't survive long enough to reproduce? Well, we've seen that play out in history, haven't we? There's even been a eugenics movement in the United States, where those who were considered to be genetically inferior suffered forced sterilization so that they would be unable to reproduce and propagate their supposedly inferior genes to everyone else. But again, if evolution is true, why would that be wrong? So the theory of evolution really cannot explain objective morality because it cannot support moral standards as the obligations that we know them to be. Okay, let's review this argument that we've been considering today. Premise 1, if objective moral standards exist, then God exists. Premise 2, objective moral standards do exist. Therefore, our conclusion is that God exists. Well, I hope considering this argument for the existence of God today has been informative to you and encouraging to you as well. And I hope that now, as you try to live out these moral standards that God has given to us, that you'll be able to do so with a little more confidence that your faith that God exists really is well supported. Thanks again for listening today, and I hope you'll continue to listen as we become even more sure and secure together.